Foundation. And Sherwin and our panelists are joining us today to discuss methods for observing and measuring trust and the impact those measurements could have on the interpretation and implementation of the law. Sherwin, I will now cede the floor to you.
Thanks very much. And thank you to everyone for being here and our panelists and our hosts. I wanted to open this panel by discussing a point that was raised earlier today about how in order to have trust, you need to have a couple of different components. First, you need to ensure that the organization that is to be trusted is worthy of that trust. And then you actually have to make sure that that trustworthiness is communicated to the people doing the trusting. So it's certainly possible to have a trusted organization that is not worthy of that trust, and it's possible to have a trustworthy organization that isn't trusted. Part of reconciling some of these aspects is being able to measure both of those components. How trustworthy is this system, and how is that trust being received by its audience? So to discuss this, we have a distinguished panel of 5 people, including Shepard Pittman, founding partner at Storyline Strategies, Kobin Zweifel-Kievan, Deputy Director of Privacy Initiatives at the Better Business Bureau, Ellery Roberts-Biddle, Editorial Director at Ranking Digital Rights, Daniel Castro, Vice President at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and Catherine Bannister, who is a Managing Director at Deloitte and head of their Tech Savvy program working on ethical technology. So, all right, so I'm hoping that we can get started with each of our panelists speaking for a brief 7 or 8 minutes, and then we can turn to discussion. So to open things up, let's start with Shepard, talking about some of the communicative aspects of this. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sherwin. Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Shepard Pittman. Like Sherwin said, I'm a founding partner with Storyline Strategies. Super quick context on where my perspective here is coming from. I'm drawing on 10 years of qualitative and quantitative research with internet users around the globe. Prior to starting Storyline, I was in market insights at Google, heading up brand and reputation insights. So coming at this from a different background than some of the other folks that we'll be talking with today. And so I really want to speak to some of the things that I and my colleagues have learned in those discussions with people, again, in all sorts of markets around the world, about a lot of topics relating to technology, to trust specifically, and how those two things intersect. And like I said, there's also a bunch of quantitative research that goes into this. Since that work has been for clients, I don't have anything that I can show you. So I'll speak for the most part to the qual aspects. And I think this is really where these ideas come to life, is how people talk about their trust in tech companies, or just as likely the lack of trust that they have, and then what can be done to build that up. I think it probably won't be a surprise to anybody listening today that trust can be lost in a minute. But building it or restoring it is a much slower and more difficult process. You can have sort of one fell swoop if there's a moment of a breach of trust, a remark that diminishes people's trust, an action that an individual or an organization takes that compromises people's trust in them. And that can last for a very long time. In the tech context, the first thing that I think of is the news a couple of years ago that Apple was deliberately slowing down iPhones. And I think that one was especially damaging because it was one of those tech things that everybody kind of had a hunch was happening, but no one had confirmed. Much like when people say, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I just talked about like wanting bananas, and then I got an ad on Instagram for bananas. It seems like my phone was listening to that. And so that moment for Apple was one that not only decreased trust because of the company's behavior, but also played into a pre-existing assumption or fear or concern that people had about what they were doing. So that's just one example. Apple has a lot of goodwill among their users, as sort of a bank there. So it probably didn't set them back as much as it would have for other companies. You can take your pick probably of Facebook incidents over the past decade that have had a similar effect. And then there's of course that compounding effect in decreasing trust when it's this string of incidents one after another that reinforce ideas about the organization, their values, and their behavior. But I think that's an important frame for this conversation. And much of my work has focused on what can individuals and organizations do to build and restore trust since it is such a harder process than losing it. In terms of some of the sort of methodology of measuring trust, since that's our topic, a few things make it an interesting prospect to research trust, especially globally. And I'm thinking now of quantitative research that my team and I did in over 45 countries for several years, asking about exactly sort of the questions we're talking about today: trust and favorability in these major tech companies, and what goes into those things. The first thing is it's hard to compare from one market to the next because of sort of typical research things like survey response style differences. A 3 out of 5 on a 5-point scale means something different from one country to the next, just in terms of how people assign value to those points. That isn't specific to trust though, but it is something that makes it even more complex to look from one country to the next and try to get a view of trust overall and find patterns. A more specific aspect of this that relates to trust is the sort of differences in the cultural baseline of trust in entities and organizations. So it's really fascinating if you're sitting talking to people in Germany about their trust in companies. They might be starting from a standpoint of skepticism and assuming that they need to be cautious and that they shouldn't just trust anything that a company says at face value, versus sort of asking the exact same question sitting in a room with people in Tokyo. There's a baseline that we heard where people said, I typically assume that companies are acting in good faith unless I've seen evidence otherwise. So they're starting from a point of thinking, I would know about it, or I will know about it if something's going wrong, but not assuming that negative intention. And then in the US, I can speak to this as a sort of cynical, savvy, or at least self-styled savvy American myself. We tend to think we know what they're doing. We can see through the marketing and the BS. And so there's that sort of orientation towards what organizations say and do, and that approach to trust. But there's also a little bit more of an openness than you see in some other markets to those messages if they're executed effectively. So the context obviously matters a lot. Another challenge is, especially if you are an entity that's working to create or build or restore trust, it's such a broad and multifaceted concept, right? I mean, trust is an enormous idea. It contains all sorts of sort of constituent concepts and behaviors and conversations. And so when you're working, as I have with organizations that are trying to find ways to take actions and communicate messages that show their intentions and that can build trust, these teams like to think that their one little effort or work stream is going to show up in their sort of overall trust numbers. So if they've run a safety campaign to show what they're doing to protect users' data in a given market, they want to see, within months, the whole company's trust score rising. Well, that's not going to happen because the trust in the company has to do with their leadership. And it's, if that's Sundar Pichai, that's going to be a very different view than if it's Mark Zuckerberg. The campaign isn't going to do a ton to mitigate whatever issues, pro or con, exist there. What's being said about them externally by other parties? What other things are they doing that are entirely unrelated to safety that still can play into trust? So we found that in terms of researching trust, you're never going to get away from being asked to get that high level trust number. How much do people trust us as a company or whatever the organization is? Leadership always wants to know that. But what's really valuable and much more illuminating is to break down trust into more specific components and ask, do you trust them to do X, Y, and Z? And that's where you start to see a lot of dimension and texture around the different aspects and components of trust. So you could say, do you trust this company to make a phone that works well? Or do you trust them to deliver a package in the same day effectively? But then you could also ask, do you trust them to pay and treat their employees fairly? Do you trust them to responsibly protect your data? Do you trust them to put users' interests ahead of profit? You're going to get very different answers to those questions as you start to unpack the concept of trust in these entities more broadly. And these things also sort of mean different things. They matter in different ways. So for example, if I don't trust you to protect my data, so I'm worried my bank account might get hacked, that might result in a very tangible action that I take in a behavioral change. I might take my data somewhere else. But if I don't trust you to put users' interest ahead of the company's interest in every case, which is true, as I'm sure is no surprise for a lot of these tech companies, if not most or all of them. That's not necessarily going to change my behavior tangibly. In fact, you'll hear, depending on, again, the cultural context and who you're talking to, but a lot of people will say, you know what, they're a business. Part of their job is to put profit as a priority. They might have responsibilities to their shareholders. So I understand that that's going on. It doesn't completely eradicate my trust, and it might not change my behavior. So what you mean when you ask people whether they trust a person or an entity is really key here. I'm going to skip ahead because there are a few more points I'm sure I'll come back around to later, but just to finish sort of this intro, in terms of communicating trust, there's a lot we can discuss. I think the key concept that's really sort of put this all into perspective for me in these conversations with users is there is a simple cost benefit analysis. And I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, but just what you hear when you talk to people, especially when it comes to tech products and services, which is what am I getting and what am I asked to give up in return? And if that nets out on the positive side for the user, again, for better or for worse, they're very likely to continue to use that product or service and engage with that company. So even if the cost is my personal data, if the benefit is convenience or connection or whatever these companies are selling and offering, that's sort of the high level calculus and rubric that people assess these things through. And you can see this with Facebook over recent years. People have felt more and more as that product has become, or that company and its apps have become ubiquitous. There's also been this sense that people have of this is not really a great use of my time. You hear a lot of people saying, I hate that I'm on Facebook. I'm sort of unhappy when I open that app, but I use it a ton anyway. So the sense of perceived value has gone down. And meanwhile, the awareness of the costs and potential harms has skyrocketed in recent years, as we all know. And so that shows up in trust in Facebook and how people think about that company. And the last point I'll make that's, I think, just a really fascinating kind of data point around this. When you ask people what is among the most sensitive data that could be collected about you, no matter where you are, who you're talking to, almost always at the top, if not or near the top of the list, is location data, right? That just makes sense. Knowing where I am at any given moment, that feels like a very private, personal, sensitive piece of data. When you ask people what products or what utility from these various services they get the most value out of, mapping and navigation almost always is among the top things, if not at the top of the list. And so when you push people on that and say, okay, just a minute ago, you said that this is the most sensitive data that could be collected about you, but now you're saying this is the app that you like the best or that you find the most utility in. Talk us through that. And people have a consciousness and an awareness of that trade-off that they're making. It is so convenient to be able to get from point A to point B, to not have to print out a map or even think about the directions ahead of time. People often say, I couldn't have got to this focus group tonight if I didn't have that app to guide me here to this address. So it's that trade-off that informs how they think about the value they're getting, how they think about whether they can and should trust the company. And then as we get into maybe more about communicating, that's, I think, key context for what users are bringing to the equation.
Thanks, Shepard. And that's there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of points for discussion. I'd like to turn now actually to Koben, where at the Better Business Bureau, I think plays an incredibly important role in navigating the trust between consumers and businesses. So thank you, Koben.
Thanks so much, Sherwin. Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say how honored I am to be up on this virtual panel because I'm a Colorado Law alumnus and a longtime attendee of this conference, formerly known as Digital Broadband Migration. So thank you, Amy, and the Silicon Flatirons team for including me. I was just thrilled by the theme of this year's event because I think trust is such a fascinating lens through which to view some of the big governance issues that we're facing today. I work for BBB National Programs, which, as a side note, is a little distinct from the Better Business Bureau system. We're separate, but the BBB used to stand for that. So you're right in that sense, and it's similar relation with businesses and consumers. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission that includes the goal of enhancing consumer trust. What that looks like on the ground is that we build and operate a variety of programs that serve as independent accountability mechanisms for self-regulatory or co-regulatory rules. When I say self-regulatory, I mean an industry came together and established enforceable rules or standards for itself. And by co-regulatory, I mean there was some government involvement, a law or regulation that provided the framework for voluntary industry participation with an accountability mechanism. Um, Unlike Shepherd, measuring trust directly is not something that I do. We don't perform industry surveys to measure how trustworthy consumers perceive a brand or industry to be. Instead, there's an implicit understanding, I think, of how trust works that drives the design and operation of our programs. So I thought I would just describe that model today as a bit of a case study because I think it can provide some lessons for how trust works in other contexts. Um, Broadly speaking, I guess there are two kinds of trust at play in our work. First is marketplace trust. I think that's how it's often phrased, which is just the willingness of consumers to engage with an industry as a whole. Sometimes particular industries suffer crises of marketplace trust. Maybe we're seeing some of that now. But an example from the 1980s was the funeral home industry, where significant levels of fraud led to more regulation at the federal and state level. When a consumer makes a determination about that kind of trustworthiness, that marketplace trust, they look, I think, to whether there are mechanisms in place to identify or remove bad actors from that industry. And that may be it may be government mechanisms or otherwise. The second kind of trust is what you might just call business trust. That's simply whether individuals trust to give the company their business. I think when you think about how you decide whether to trust a business, you realize that that trust can't exist in a vacuum. You don't trust a business just because it says, trust us. The words and actions of a company certainly play a role, and I think Shepherd was talking about some of these factors, but trust also requires independent indicators. Consumers, I think, should start with a healthy mistrust and look to external sources to verify trustworthiness. So at both of those levels, marketplace and individual business trust, creating the conditions for individuals to make more informed decisions about trustworthiness requires there to be trusted third-party indicators. And that's where our programs have come in historically. I'm a privacy lawyer, so my work focuses on consumer privacy. The marketplace trust in the programs that I operate has to do with whether consumers trust an industry enough to participate with their personal data. You can think here of the ad tech industry. In the same context, business trust is about whether consumers trust an individual business with their personal data, and also whether businesses trust each other to process personal data in keeping with equivalent standards. I can't talk about all of our privacy programs in the time that I have, so let me touch on some themes, 3 themes that I believe are necessary when designing independent mechanisms that foster trust. Clear and enforceable standards, transparent procedures, and verifiable indicators. I'll go ahead and apply those to a case study that's near and dear to my heart, the commercial elements of the Privacy Shield framework. Just a quick primer on Privacy Shield. It's a co-regulatory mechanism where businesses commit to a certain set of minimum privacy standards when receiving personal data from Europeans in the United States. I help to operate BBB EU Privacy Shield, which is an independent recourse mechanism under that framework, ensuring that EU data subjects have somewhere to turn with their privacy complaints against US businesses. So my 3 themes, clear and enforceable standards. What you see in Privacy Shield is a fully fledged framework for data processing standards. There's clarity in the standards, and that's essential because without it, you can't tell whether individual actors are meeting the requirements. Our accountability programs use various tools to enforce standards, certification, independent monitoring, dispute resolution, and so on. But you can't have enforcement without clarity. Businesses also make their commitment to these standards clear by including them in their privacy policy, which of course makes them enforceable by the Federal Trade Commission, as we just saw in the recent case against Flow Health, which involved Privacy Shield commitments. Now, there's another layer to those themes that I mentioned they kind of work on two levels, on the level of business practices, but also in how the accountability mechanism itself is designed. This is because I think you can't rely on that third-party indicator unless it is itself trustworthy. Privacy Shield also includes, on the accountability agent level, clear rules and guidelines of the minimum requirements for how our program should operate. This includes the teeth of the mechanism that we serve, which is that under certain circumstances, we have to refer participants to a government agency if they were to stop complying with the rules. Transparent procedures are also necessary. In the Privacy Shield context, the process for self-certifying under the framework is clearly laid out. If a company participates in the program, it is easy to figure out what it has demonstrated in order to do so. On the accountability agent level, our program provides full transparency for our rules and procedures. Without kind of that heightened level of transparency, you lose the power to enforce. For example, at every step in our dispute resolution process, we can point to published procedures that have already been agreed to by the participating business, either in its privacy policy or as part of its contract with us. And then finally, verifiable indicators. A company's status in Privacy Shield can always be checked on the public listing of participating businesses managed by the Department of Commerce. In order to be verifiable, this must be kept up to date. If a company lapses in meeting its requirements, this is reflected immediately. At the next level, the accountability agent itself is also under obligations to publish, of transparency, publishing indicators of quality as part of that for us, including statistics about consumer complaints, how many we receive, case notes about dispute resolution outcomes, things like that. Basically, nowhere in the system is anyone asked to trust without the opportunity to verify. I think that those three themes speak to the potential for multi-layered mechanisms of accountability to foster trust in a variety of contexts. Trust is not the product here, but trust emerges from those systems when they are appropriately designed. Rather than asking individuals to trust, these systems assume that mistrust is part of the proper order of things and provide opportunities for businesses to demonstrate their trustworthiness.
Thanks very much, Koban. So Shepard mentioned that there's different types of trust and different ways that people might trust a business, whether it's as a customer or to do the right thing. And I think that that brings us to Ellery next in terms of ranking digital rights and how companies or organizations might respect human rights. So Ellery, please.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. This is really fun. So I guess I'm going to start with a red flag. I think that what Koban was just saying, do consumers trust a company enough to use a product or service that that company provides? That is it's a powerful question, but from where I'm sitting, and I'll say where that is in a minute, it is becoming a little bit irrelevant. And the reason for that is because we don't have a lot of choice in what kinds of products and services we use when it comes to the internet and communications in general. So I work with Ranking Digital Rights, which is a program housed at New America that looks at the world's most powerful digital platforms and telecommunications companies and conducts basically annual ranking of those companies' commitments, meaning things that they say in their policies and also data that they publish, their commitments to users' human rights. And we don't look at all human rights, we look specifically at freedom of expression and privacy for reasons that I think this crowd is familiar with. So I won't get into that, but the way that the approach that we take starts with a sort of foundational idea that companies that we have within the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and more specifically, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, really powerful tools at our disposal to make it so that companies like Google, Facebook, Baidu, Tencent, Yandex, Mail.ru, these are all companies that we rank. I could go on, so that they are operating in such a way that actually respects users' rights to freedom of expression, including freedom of information and privacy. And we've been doing this ranking for 5 years now. And before I forget, want to say that our latest ranking will be coming out on February 24th. And what's happened, and spoiler alert, hasn't changed, is the companies aren't doing that well. The best of times, a couple of companies in the US have scored in the 60 out of 100 points range. All of the companies had, or most companies, particularly those based in the United States, actually kind of came down a notch this year. And the reason for that is that we brought a number of new questions to the table about algorithms and what we're calling algorithmic systems. How do companies develop their algorithms? What data do they collect? How do they use that data to train their technology? And then they build some systems and then they deploy them. How do they do that? How are they used? How are algorithms used to determine what information we see in our news feed, what ads appear, what kinds of groups might be recommended to us on, say, Facebook? So the Facebook recommendation algorithm, I'll just pause on for a second, has been kind of a hot topic lately because of its tendency that actually Facebook's own research has shown to recommend extreme groups. And then there was a study that Facebook carried out in Germany in 2016, in which they found that 64% of the time when a person joined a political extremist group, it was because they had, or at least it was in response to Facebook recommending that they join the group. In the context of the United States and recent events that took place at the Capitol, this is a pretty serious thing. And the reason that I'm sort of focusing on our indicators on algorithms, and I'm not really giving anything away about the results that we'll release on February 24th, is that none of the big companies that are most powerful in determining all of these things that we see in the internet have anything near close to transparency on how they build these systems and how the systems work. So this is a bit scary. The stakes are incredibly high, and the amount of information we don't have is alarming. When sort of coming here today, that even the idea of trying to measure trust or sort of step back and think about how companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Twitter cultivate trust, it is important, but we have some really, really big, like the stakes are incredibly high. Many of us are kind of stuck using these platforms because these are the places where we can communicate, where we can connect with others, whether they're colleagues, loved ones, what have you. And the stakes go well beyond some of even the things that we're measuring. Like we don't, international human rights doctrine doesn't super specifically address reality. How do you understand, like what Naima was talking about just before our session? How do you figure out what information is trustworthy or real? The fundamentalness of that question, I don't think can be overstated. So I guess how am I doing on time, Sherwin?
You've got a couple minutes left.
Couple minutes left. Okay, so I wanted to share just one other example. Prior to working with Ranking Digital Rights, I worked with Global Voices, and Global Voices is an international citizen media organization that came up in 2005 in a period in which the ideas like crowdsourcing and super open, transparent systems in the internet could be a great way to generate information, because instead of just needing to trust what you saw, what a specific source or platform told you, you could really dig in and figure out exactly how was a given news article, or in the case of Wikipedia, how just an information article came into being. And at Global Voices, we covered all kinds of issues, but issues around technology, human rights, access to news and information were very close to our hearts. And a couple of years ago, we found ourselves in a debate about a specific program that Facebook developed called Free Basics. Free Basics is a 0-rated app that I'm coming up on time. Okay, I'll be really quick. A 0-rated app that Facebook rolled out in an effort to build an on-ramp for people in developing countries who did not have access to the internet. And so this is an app that gives you access to Facebook and some other content online. And we got into a big sort of like question about, is this a valuable thing or not? And what are the pros and cons? And we did a series of case studies in 6 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in which we actually were able to just look at what does it look like in this place, post a ton of screenshots, and then have a discussion about all of the different trade-offs that this program was sort of asking people to make. And I won't go into more detail about it here because we're at time. But I guess I just think that it's such a wide open field, and that there is a tremendous value in this discussion, I hope, and looking at what distributed efforts at finding information can do for building trust in this sphere.
Thanks very much, Ellery. And if I'm being a little bit aggressive in messaging people at time limits, it's because I hope we can have a nice discussion afterwards between the panelists and in response to various questions we're seeing. So with that in mind, I'd actually like to turn to Daniel for his perspective on our discussion so far. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Sherwin, and really happy to be here and participate in this panel. So I wanted to step back for a minute and talk about why trust is so important to the tech policy discussion. So for a long time, the U.S. generally embraced a light touch regulatory approach to tech policy. And when policymakers would propose stricter laws and regulations, they'd often face resistance from people that say, well, these regulations will impose more cost, or they're going to limit business models. So in short, more regulation was often seen as antithetical to digital innovation, and nobody really wants to be against innovation, especially when that innovation is leading to economic growth and other societal benefits. But somewhere along the line, the argument for stricter digital regulation changed. So instead of saying these regulations were just about protecting consumers, the argument evolved to be these regulations are needed to increase trust. And without trust, the argument would go, you can't have consumer adoption, which drives innovation. So it's this kind of demand-driven innovation. So of course, policymakers really like that. It's a win-win. You can regulate and you can protect consumers, and you can also get innovation. So it's a very smart way to make that argument. Now, I think as many kind of popular but ultimately misguided ideas go, there's definitely an element of truth to this. For example, nobody wants to get in an airplane that has a reputation for crashing. You want to trust that these products work as intended. But the relationship between regulation and trust, and the relationship between regulation and adoption, is not this kind of purely linear relationship that I think sometimes policymakers have oversimplified it to be. So more regulation doesn't necessarily lead to more trust, and more regulation doesn't necessarily lead to more adoption. Beyond a kind of baseline level of regulation, more regulation doesn't necessarily continue to increase trust. And we can actually see this in the numbers. So for example, we did a study a while back that dug into this in a number of different areas. I want to highlight a few of these. In 2014, Gallup did a poll that showed only 2% of Americans expressed trust in social networks, and only 6% trusted online retailers. Incredibly low numbers. Same year, of course, 62% of Americans were using social networks and 47% were using this for online shopping. And we've seen similar gaps between, these kind of qualitative questions or polling questions around asking consumers, do you trust various companies and technologies, and usage, and everything from email providers to search engines. The clearest and kind of most recent example of this also comes from Europe with the GDPR. So the GDPR was specifically designed to increase consumer trust in the digital economy. 6 months after the GDPR went into effect, the European Commission's own polling, which they put out in the Eurobarometer, showed that online consumer trust had declined. Only 32% of EU respondents indicated that they tended to trust the internet, which was down 2 percentage points from a year earlier. Moreover, that was actually the lowest this trust had been in a decade. Again, this is 6 months after the EU implemented their kind of gold standard data protection law. Similarly, in this report we did a few years back, we also were asking, whether there was a significant difference in digital adoption in countries that have adopted various digital policy regulations compared to those that haven't. And there weren't. Again, you see the levels of confidence and the levels of trust are basically more or less the same across countries when they have a baseline level of protection. In fact, some of the countries that have higher levels of regulation have lower levels of trust. And so what's interesting to me is that now we're seeing this discussion about trust again arise in the context of different emerging technologies. In particular, we're seeing this around artificial intelligence. For example, right now there's this movement for trustworthy AI. We're seeing this both in the United States and in Europe. And again, the argument here is that you need trustworthy AI in order to enable more adoption. And so if you want to succeed in AI, if a country wants to succeed in AI, they need to get the regulation right. So, one of the problems when we talk about trust is that nobody agrees on the definition. There was a 2011 study that reviewed 171 papers over 48 years and found over 129 different measures of trust. Because as Shepard said, there's a lot of different ways you can break this down. In the context of AI, we're often seeing proposals to use proxy measurements of trust. And so one of the proxies that we often hear about is explainability of algorithms. But the problem with these proxies is that they're often actually really poor substitutes for trust. So I want to give a specific example here. So you could consider, 2 AI systems designed to predict whether it will rain tomorrow. One system is accurate 9 times out of 10, but it provides absolutely no explanation for its prediction. Another system is accurate 7 times out of 10, but it explains why, which factors it primarily uses to make its assessment, air temperature, air pressure, wind speed, whatever it is. So even though the latter system provides an explanation, users are probably more likely to trust the one that is wrong less often. Now, you might just say, well, I'm offering you a false choice here, that you don't have to necessarily choose between an accurate system with no explanation and a less accurate one with an explanation. Right now, in a lot of the AI systems, we do see that trade-off, but presumably in the future, that might go away. But what's really interesting to me here is that even if you add explanations to highly accurate systems, users' trust can still decline. And the reason for this is that when systems provide an explanation and this new information, the rationale, the explanation for why the system is making this prediction conflicts with the user's mental model, that creates distrust on the user, even if that prediction is right. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but we've actually seen user studies prove this out. So what's interesting is that in some cases, the AI system that is most trustworthy is the one that's highly accurate and provides no explanation. So my point here is just that we need to be very nuanced in how we talk about trust and not take for granted some of these different assumptions between, about how we might make between regulation and trust or between trust and adoption. And we also shouldn't consider trust independently, but instead we should think about, how it relates to multiple factors, including price and quality that can impact consumer adoption and can impact consumer welfare. And the last point I want to make is that we're also seeing this question about trust now being applied to the country of origin of different technology products. That's another kind of metric or stand-in we're seeing. And I think this is a huge mistake, especially when we're talking about the objective technical capabilities of different products. So, and we've also seen, I think, competitors, whether it's kind of national level competitors competing against different countries, or just pure competitors in the marketplace, more or less weaponize trust to go after their competitors. So we saw this after the Snowden revelations when this was used against US cloud providers. More recently, we've seen this against the Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky, where it was kept out of the US market, mostly through rumors about potential links to Russian intelligence. We've seen this very recently against Chinese-owned companies with TikTok and WeChat. We've seen it against DJI and other drone manufacturers. And so when it comes to proposals to limit foreign companies, especially to entirely block them from the market, I think it's very problematic when we don't have a reliable framework for objective security. And instead we rely on these rules of thumb that foreign is bad or that not made in this country is bad. Because ultimately, that's going to lead to less openness in the digital economy. It's going to lead to less free trade, and it will hurt US commercial and consumer interest. So I'll stop there. Really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And again, many more points for discussion that I'm looking forward to after. But first, last but not least, we hear from Catherine talking about ethical technology. So please.
Yeah, sure. And I want to echo everyone's thanks for allowing me to be here on such a great panel with such varying perspectives and viewpoints. And I'm bringing a fifth one. So I am the co-director of trustworthy and ethical tech for the Deloitte US firms. And as such, we study or we look at organizations as a whole, organizational trust. And specifically, I look at the relationship between trust and ethical technology, prioritizing ethical technology at organizations, and then importantly, how do you operationalize that in an organization so that you can lead to enhanced trust? So if I start with the relationship between trust and ethical tech, we saw this as about a year ago, one of our tech trends that we were seeing with the advancement of digital enablement, that organizations as a whole, and we're talking about organizations across the spectrum, not just big tech, but organizations who are not known as technology organizations, but that use technology for and for their consumers, for their constituents, et cetera. Organizations are asking for newer and deeper forms of trust from their constituents, from their consumers, from their customers, and increasingly from their own employees. And what we're seeing is that, this is not surprising, because as tech continues to evolve and accelerate and permeate all aspects of the organization, so has those same stakeholders' own tech savviness, their own awareness of the ethical dilemmas that are presented by high profile examples of data gone awry or data usage, et cetera. And so what we've seen is that we've moved from this notion of what can you do, which is kind of guided by law and regulation, to what should you do as an organization, where the law is silent or the regulation hasn't kept up with the guidance for this. And that's where this notion of ethical decision making comes into play, of how can an organization infuse this concept of doing responsible tech, doing ethical tech throughout their organization. So as we've looked into it, we've prioritized or we've looked at how organizations that are doing this well have prioritized ethical technology throughout their organization. And you'll notice that I'm talking about technology in general. We've been really careful to examine this tech agnostically. We do hear a lot of the more high profile like AI and facial recognition and social platforms and all of the things that we've been talking about today. But for many organizations, there's inherent technology. If you think about every company now being a tech company at its core and everybody using the data, it's incumbent upon these organizations to really think about where they have technology and they have ethical concerns about the use and the design and the deployment of those technologies as a whole. And so what we found is that those organizations that are more digitally advanced are also correspondingly more concerned about the ethical implications of those technologies that they are using. And it doesn't all just go back to their technological maturity. It in many times typically goes back to the leadership's mindset and the practice and the mentality that the leader themselves sets for the organization. No surprise, we also find that similarly those leaders have a high interest in social impact, which probably precludes them to thinking about ethical implications of corporate actions and the organization. We see a high support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we've seen through ethical decision making is that specifically around technology, is that the more diverse perspectives, the more voices and input to the design and the deployment and use of technology, the more ethical outcomes, the less harm to any one group or more is inherent. And then finally, we've seen that those organizations and those leaders provide a structured, embedded decision-making framework or guidance for behaviors in that organization, which leads me to the third part of where we really are digging in is how do you operationalize this in an organization? How do you infuse and embed an ethical tech mindset so that you can elevate trust both internally and externally for the organization? And we really think that it's three-pronged. It requires what we call a 360-degree undertaking. You have to look at your technology, you have to look at your processes, and you have to look at your people. From a technology standpoint, you need to make sure that your technologies that you're either designing, using, or deploying are aligned with your corporate values and human values, to Ellery's point. That you have to set the expectation and the permission for interrogating the decision making that goes against those technologies, so that your teams are bringing the right mindset and are applying the right framework. And that goes to the next thing, which is processes, which is you have to set and clearly articulate the guidance, the policies, the approaches that you want your organization to take on these. And you need to provide the framework and provide the space for those conversations and those decisions to be made. And that also goes to the people aspect, which is, we like to say that doing ethical tech is a team sport. It has to be relevant to every member of the organization. And that it's important to find use cases that are going to resonate with everyone wherever they sit in the technology spectrum, in the tech savvy spectrum, meaning that not everybody is going to be in the weeds of the technology. So not every use case is going to resonate with them. But if you can find examples of, if they're in HR, for example, talk about using AI for recruiting and what are some of the ethical dilemmas that could be presented, and get practitioners and employees to be thinking about what groups could be impacted adversely by the technology or by the processes that we're implementing, and widen the aperture, bring diverse voices to the table, and really make sure that you're embedding these decision-making processes along the way. So what we found is that if you truly prioritize ethical tech in your organization and you operationalize it, then the trust factor, and going back to Shepard who opened this, trust can be lost in a second. But if you're paying attention to the decisions that you're making and the technologies that you're using and the impacts that they can have, not only external to your organization, but internally, then you can kind of weather that trust storm a little better, and elevate the trust of the organization and the participants in the technology along the way.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we have a couple of questions for the panel from Colorado students. So I think we have them from our Connor and Miguel available. If not, I think we do have a number of questions also in the chat. Oh, here we go, sorry. There we are. I see Connor's logged in, so whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you all for being here. This was a great discussion. So Shepard had discussed the importance of transactional calculations in consumers' relationships with and understanding of companies today. Do you think that at other times in the last century, norms and cultural expectations played a larger role in consumers' relationship with companies than it does today? And if so, how do you think it would have been possible for a lot of these tech platforms to develop in the way that they have in that era? Thank you.
Yeah, I can take that. Could tell me a bit more about what you mean by, like, what sorts of norms do you have in mind that might sort of persist or have been different earlier, that sort of the current products and relationship to companies might have altered?
Well, just when you were discussing how, it's really important to consider what consumers are thinking about, what am I getting from this service versus what am I giving up? And, that obviously has been a key factor throughout history probably, but it seems like at certain times there were more expectations about how people assumed that companies would treat them. And I was just curious if you think, how these companies might look different if they'd evolved in that era.
I think I'm going to give a very, very rough and off-the-cuff trajectory that I sort of see the three phases of this. Essentially, let me start at the end. I think the biggest change or what defines this era with that transactional nature and the calculations that people make is the costs are often invisible, or at least not visible until far after the fact. So if you think back to the earliest sort of transactions, you're trading a sheep for a wheel of cheese or whatever it is. And I have this wheel of cheese, I can see it, I give you that, I go home with the sheep. There's probably something earlier than that, but you see what I'm saying, was physical transactions right in front of you. Then you sort of move to more abstract transactions. And I think the idea of a credit card is closer to, in some senses, what we're looking at now with tech companies. And I'm thinking primarily of our data as the cost that we're talking about here. There are certainly other costs and harms that others have spoken to. I think the misinformation piece that Ellery mentioned and that the previous talk was about is really crucial in there. But in terms of data, I certainly don't see my data flowing back to the company. I'm sorry, so I'm tying this to the second point, which is the credit card. You know that there's a cost, but it is abstract because you're not paying right now. There's nothing physical that's being exchanged. And in fact, there's not even money being exchanged in the moment, right? It's just, it's very abstract, it's theoretical. That gets us closer to what it's like now. But there might not even ever be an awareness of the cost. So with the credit card, you eventually have to pay the bill and you're aware of that transaction when it occurs. With your data, your privacy might be violated and you would never even know it. So in some senses, there's more tension and anxiety and because of that uncertainty that people feel. I never know for sure what's happening with my data or how it's being used, but I see these signals, Cambridge Analytica, Prism, whatever the example is you want to point to, where clearly something's going on behind the scenes. But there's never a pain point unless you personally get hacked, really, basically, or have your bank account violated or something tangible like that, which is fairly rare for most users. You know that there's a cost, but it's an invisible one. It's not one that you sense or feel. There's no one moment in time when it occurs. And then remember, while that's going on, the benefits are very, very immediate and visible. And you're experiencing that ability to navigate quickly, or the app that sort of helps you pass time, or talking to people around the globe, whatever it is, that's real. The cost is easy to ignore, and users, frankly, are incentivized to ignore it unless it becomes very high or present. And I'll stop with this, but I think a key thing to remember here is people want to keep using these products. They want the answer to these questions that they have about data privacy and security, for example. They want to be reassured that it's okay. They don't want to learn information that's going
Shepard,
to.
I think, sorry, I just want to make sure that we have enough time both to cover this question fully and also to get to Miguel. But I think Ellery wanted to step in here.
Sure, just quickly. I think one of the things that's really tough about what Shepard's talking about, so many technologies take our data and they use it, but we don't really see what happens. So it's not some big, horrible privacy violation suddenly blows up in your face necessarily. But we are starting to see like it comes back to somebody. And I think a really powerful example of this is in facial recognition algorithms and how biased they've been proven to be. So many police departments in the United States use this technology to try to identify people in, security or even Ring doorbell camera footage when a crime has been committed. Researchers at MIT have shown pretty clearly that there's a very strong race and gender bias in a lot of these technologies. And then it has come out to harm people. A sort of terrific example in the New York Times this past June, it's a great piece by Kashmir Hill about a Black man in Michigan who police showed up at his house, arrested him for a robbery that he did not commit based solely on security camera footage in which police took that footage, stuck it into this program, and it looks at a database of driver's license in the state of Michigan and pulls up this guy, and they say, okay, that it was him. And they bring the guy in and they show him a picture of this footage. And he says, you can see that's not me, right? And holds it up, and the police said, you're right, that does not look like you. So it's, all of this data is coming from different sources, and then it does have profound consequences for some people's lives, but it is so often hard to draw those connections. But I do think it's beginning to happen more and more.
Thanks. Any reactions or commentary from the rest of the panel?
I'd just like to weigh in just briefly. I think it's important on the facial recognition part of it, just because this is an area I've done a lot of work. There's the MIT study that Ellery mentioned that was on facial analysis. So doing like gender identity, and that's where the biggest biases have been seen. The NIST study that looked at facial recognition, so not facial characteristics, but facial recognition, showed that there was actually a wide variety in the levels of performance. Some systems did have disparities around race or skin color specifically, and male, female, but others had very little difference. So on facial recognition, I think it's just really important that, and this is relevant to this context about this question of trust, people see headlines and they see one-off stories about someone whose lives have tremendously impacted by the technology not working right, or in some of these cases, it's the technology worked the way it was supposed to, but then there were complete failures in the policing system. For example, not asking witnesses, not doing any of the detective work. But then the net effect is that the assumption in the back of people's mind is that facial recognition doesn't work, or we should ban it, like San Francisco did, or other takeaways that you might get, or the technology just can't be trusted. Or vendors of this technology are bad because why are they pushing this racist, biased, sexist software? And so I think that whole context actually colors these types of discussions, and the complexities of some of this. I mean, if you look at the recent NIST studies, there's I think 20 different technical appendices that digging through it and actually making sense of it can take weeks. And asking the average person to understand that is actually really difficult. So I just wanted to weigh in on that one because I think it's actually a great example of how information gets filtered through this environment that then shapes how we think about technology.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you all.
Connor, did you?
Oh, no, I just want to say thank you for the responses.
Thanks. I did think it was interesting to have that discussion of sort of trade-offs versus norms, and something I would want to consider is the idea of the fact that norms define sort of what people consider the costs are to them in terms of what they're giving up and what they're gaining. But also, we want to make sure that we get this question from Miguel. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting conversation. So my question is, how do you think the pandemic has affected trust and public sentiment in the tech sector? Obviously, it is a very broad question, but if you have any specific technologies that you'd like to talk about.
Well, Zoom bombing is what everyone was talking about a year ago. So I think that's a great example. I mean, to me, it's a perfect example of how, pre-pandemic, the Zoom users, which were, kind of a small and faithful group, really loved it. It broadened out to everyone, and suddenly, no one trusted Zoom for a while. And even today, you still have some federal agencies that have policies that don't allow them to use it. And you've also seen many competitors swoop in and talk about why their products are better. So I think it's a great example of how, as technology is really put to the test, and more users experience it, companies have to think about the various ways their technology might be used and misused, and react to that. And it's not going to be the same for everyone. And I just think one of the most important things, and to get to a comment I saw in the TechSpace chat, this is why it's important to have feedback loops, so that when different communities are affected different ways by technologies, they can have a voice in the process, and they can hear and see if their voice is being listened to or not.
Yeah, I would say for sure video conferencing, because we've all moved that way. I think the other uptick in workforce technologies would be in productivity tools, so that employers can monitor remote workers and all of that. And it will be interesting, I think, to see how prevalent those become, and how employees react to the keystroke and the measurement of what productivity means when you are not physically co-located. That would be another area that I see has been pandemically impacted.
I think to our conversation about trade-offs as well, we've been hearing in conversations with users that this might not be to trust specifically, but certainly their favorability and sort of general sentiment towards some of these companies and products has shifted, because I think Facebook is a great example. I mentioned at the start, a lot of people feel a little antsy about their use of Facebook at best. But during this past year, we've heard people saying that they are finding value there again, that it is vital as a way to connect with people, again, for better or for worse. And so it'll be interesting to watch whether that increase in the sense of value has any effect on sort of counterbalancing all of the other negative narratives that are out there at the same time.
I'm curious if the panel has reactions to the idea that the pandemic means that we're relying more upon these mechanisms. So on the one hand, people are getting value out of using these because it's the way that we're connecting. But also it means that maybe people feel more vulnerable in that if they don't feel the ability to have alternatives to meet in person and so on, that means that it's all that much more important that they trust these systems, or that might lead to them worrying more about whether they can be trusted. Do people have reactions to that?
Well, I think that goes a little bit back to Ellery's point about people's reliance on these technologies for various things, and the fact that, yeah, maybe it puts that into stark perspective when we're dealing with a crisis like this. I was thinking about just going back to sort of the governance process issues that we kind of started talking about at the beginning. I think this offers an opportunity, like when you're confronted with a crisis, I think it maybe shows a little bit how prepared you were in terms of maybe the internal processes that Catherine was talking about, or external about accountability mechanisms. Can they react to new risks and new kind of cost benefit analyses, because I think if they're properly structured, it allows for thinking through some of these ethical issues in new circumstances.
Just to sort of add a little bit to that, and in thinking about the ways that companies weren't prepared for the pandemic, we, in our forthcoming launch, we take a look at the ways that YouTube and Facebook handled appeals of content moderation decisions. So if you have a piece of content, a video on YouTube or something you post on Facebook, it gets removed because of a violation of terms of service or community standards, you can appeal it. How does the appeals process work? Who handles that stuff? In what we call the before times or normal times, there are quite a lot of human beings involved in the process of taking a look at appeals and deciding what to do. Well, then the pandemic came and those humans had to go home. And because of the way that the systems are set up, both companies said, we're going to have to rely on our technology more. We're going to have to put the algorithms to the test. And the really interesting outcome that you can see in the two companies' transparency reports from Q2 and Q3 in 2020 is that, so at Google or with YouTube, the number of appeals went up, and the way that the company responded to them also rose. And so what YouTube sort of explained was, we relied more on technology to review this stuff, and we assumed that the technology would not make great choices. And so then we doubled down at the next level. And so more decisions were appealed, but more content was restored as a result of appeal. Super interesting. In the case of Facebook, same sort of starting point. They need to rely more on technology, but the appeals system kind of disappeared. The company was able to handle very, very few, to the extent that when you look at the transparency report, you have to do some little tricks with your mouse to see how many appeals were formally recognized and how much content was restored as a result. And the company later remarked on this and said, basically, we couldn't, for a little while, we weren't able to offer this. So it's sort of a fascinating kind of place where the literal human issue that everybody was facing kind of collided right in with this ongoing kind of incredibly complex, difficult set of conversations around content moderation.
I want to make sure that we get to a couple of the questions, at least a couple of the questions in the chat. And there's a couple here that I think are related, so I'm going to present them together. So Richard is asking, is there any reason to believe that any number of watchdogs can verify the trustworthiness of any consumer-facing technical system? Even the public interest sector has agendas. And related to this, I think Cliff is asking, thoughts about trust in platform regulators, for example, government agencies, and in the capability of users to use platforms responsibly. So I guess there's an element of asking, so yeah, how do you trust the watchers?
I mean, I tried a little bit to talk about that in my remarks, just in the fact that I don't think we should assume a trusted agent, that there's no purely trusted agent out there that we should assume exists and should be the arbiter of all trust, right? We're not, it's turtles all the way down. You're not at any point going to get, like, people, the issue is everywhere, that people mistrust the government, people mistrust public interest sector. Everyone does have an agenda, and I think you can design systems in a way that assume that where there are checks and balances, where there are different, you have multiple layers of mechanisms that can help to at least shed transparency, if nothing else, on those agendas, trying to design it in a way that provides that context for everyone in the ecosystem. But it's hard.
It's harder from a consumer standpoint. I will say, we've heard consistently for years that people do not trust government to effectively oversee tech companies. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier on with which aspect of trust are you talking about? It's more from a competence and capability perspective. They just don't think the government is nearly fast, agile, or knowledgeable enough to do it. I actually done polling on this, and the only segment that was even less confident in government's ability than kind of the general public, we had an oversample of people who worked directly in and around federal government in DC, and they were even more likely to say the government is not prepared and equipped to handle these kinds of questions. It's not to say that people don't think that the government should be involved in making those attempts, but confidence in the actual competency to do it, sadly, is not super high.
And actually, I think leading into this, I know some of you addressed Rich's question a little bit in earlier responses, but I think this might lead into this pretty well in terms of what feedback loops are available, right? So there's multiple different parts of building this cycle of communication, and certainly there's going to be regulatory elements at play. There's going to be self-regulatory and co-regulatory elements at play. There's going to be consumer feedback at play. So what, are there other mechanisms? Are there ways, or is it futile to try and bring these things together? Not to try to be too cynical.
I mean, I think just to quickly touch on that, I think that there's a lot depends on context. I think this conference is rightfully talking about trust as a broad construct because it lets us approach a variety of a number of issues that we're facing right now. And I don't know that the solutions will be the same for content moderation as they are for privacy, or for example. And I think that those different challenges require different structural solutions to them. But your question is a good one. Your cynical question is a good one. It's hard to answer.
It looks like Rich has a follow-up, which might sort of narrow things down. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you propose?
I think here trust might be, maybe moving us away from, what we really want, which is a focus on, kind of innovation, adoption, and kind of fixing problems that are out there. So in some ways, it doesn't matter if I, trust Facebook. It matters maybe, the impact of social networking on democracy or on my ability to communicate, or there's various other metrics that we could look at. And I think getting to some of that, even some of the very concrete ones, like, is this platform secure? Does it do what it says it does when it talks about end-to-end communication and encryption? I think moving to some of those more clearer metrics will get us to better answers, because at the end of the day, especially in content moderation, there's not going to be agreement on what that should look like. So we just have to accept that there's going to be some differences there, and instead focus on some of these other kind of more viable metrics.
I guess I'll just add that I think that there's something that a few of the questions seem to hit at a little bit, is the sort of challenge of just understandability. I mean, I'm some hovering around usability and accessibility, but that in a lot of cases with technology, there's this whole layer of stuff happening that the average user really doesn't understand. And even if and an explanation runs into a lot of different challenges. Twitter can explain what factors go into timeline to a regular user, and the way that explanation will look really different than the explanation you'd offer to an expert, to a programmer or whatever. And that's sort of the challenge of the zone that we're in, is where do we find language and tools that can give people kind of a bridge to understand more, but not to feel sort of excluded. A lot of times in conversations about algorithmic transparency, nutrition labels have been brought up as this sort of, there's some bridge that, like, do I know everything in a nutrition label even is. No, but I've kind of learned like what types of things do I think okay, and where do I think like that sounds like a high percentage of saturated fat, I'll skip it. So maybe there's a future where those types of bridging information mechanisms become more something that's more prevalent, and that helps people just at least know more about what they're using.
I want to make sure that that anybody who has a final intervention they'd want to make on this topic has a chance to do so. But I do want to note that we are coming up, if not a little bit past time. So it's not seeing anybody speaking up. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for appearing today, and turn it over with thanks to our hosts again. Thank you.
Thank you